have had the qualitative lecture last week, all right? So when you meet with Dr. Berkey next week, she'll fill in some of the holes from today, hopefully, okay? So when we're looking at quantitative data collection, then we're looking at collecting data that has numbers, that there's going to be measures of numbers, all right? When you talk about qualitative next week, you'll see that what you're talking about is people's feelings, their perceptions, much more ambivalent, harder to analyze than quantitative data. Typically what we find is that quantitative experiments, it's not that quantitative or qualitative are easier or harder than each other, they're just really different. If I'm doing a quantitative study, then there's heaps and heaps of work up front, setting the study up, making sure that you've accounted for limitations and that you're going to collect the data in such a way that the analysis will be credible, right? So you have to do a lot of work in the front end of the study. Once you've got the data and you've got this pile of numbers, you chuck it all into a software package, and the software package analyzes it for you, and you end up doing a discussion based upon the numbers that you get back. So there's less work to do from an analysis point of view these days because we don't analyze it by hand anymore, right? When you look at a qualitative study, it tends to be the other way around. There's not very much to do setting it up at the beginning other than finding your participants, because you're going to evolve the study as you work through the interviews or the surveys or however it is you're going to collect that data. But when you've got your videotapes, your audio tapes, however you've collected this data, the analysis, the results section and the analysis section for a qualitative paper is huge, huge, the amount of work you have to do, right? So it's just the workload is in a different place within the study, right? So if it's quantitative, then we're going to get a pile of numbers. We have to make sure up front that we have controlled for the participants. So what's the question I'm asking? Have I picked an appropriate population? Can I get to that population? Am I looking for women, or am I looking for women aged 30 to 40? Right? How specific do I need to be collecting participant agreements based upon the question that I'm asking? I have to control as much as possible for my environment. So if I'm going to collect data on more than one occasion, then I should be able to say pretty safely that there wasn't a change in the environment that could have altered the data. Right? So when we're outside, we have to be a little bit careful, because if I'm looking at jumping skills, and one day it's hot and sunny and the next day it's really, really windy or really, really wet, can I honestly say that the environment didn't impact a jumping skill? Right? If someone's worried about slipping, or if they're jumping into the wind, does that change their technique? Right? So how am I going to set it up so I have as little worry about the environment impacting the data? Same thing with the task. I've got to find a way of keeping the task as consistent as possible across the whole data collection. If I'm getting participants in Oregon to do something and I'm going to compare them with participants in Florida, I'm not going to fly to Oregon and Florida. So how do I know the task has been done exactly the same way so I can compare those two pieces of data, right? So there's a lot of planning involved ahead of time. And I've got to be aware of what my limitations are. You can't control most of the time for everything, particularly not in my world where my data is real-world applied data. It's easier to control the limitations and the factors when you're inside in a lab. It's very hard when you're outside working with people and the weather, and right? So the idea though is I want to keep my limitations to a minimum. If your limitations section, and most, I believe Dr. Berkey will get you to put your limitations into chapter 1, right? Then if you have a list of limitations that's 10 factors long, you need to rethink your study, right? Because that's not, you haven't control for anything. The study's not really very worthwhile, right? So you want to be able to control your limitations as much as possible. I brought everybody in and I gave them a survey, and up front I asked them to be as honest as possible. Are they as honest as possible? You don't know, right? So you have to say it's a limitation that possibly the survey wasn't answered honestly. But you did what you could to try to keep that under control, right? Typically with a quantitative study, then we are looking to be able to predict an outcome, or possibly we're looking at cause and effect. So we're looking at a relationship. I want to be able to say, if I use this, okay, so I'll fall back on one that a friend did in grad school. He was looking at, it was a while ago, but he was looking at those full swimsuits that they wear. He was working with Nike or Speedo, and he was investigating whether or not the full swimsuit really decreased drag in the water, or did it not make any difference, right? So what we want, of course, what Speedo wanted, what he wanted, was to show that if you use the full suit, then it shaves 2/100ths off your 50-meter time, or whatever, right? So we want to be able to make a prediction that using this suit or using this training program will improve the dependent variable. Right? And a design issue here that you want to start looking for when you're reading now is it set up so that we're collecting data between two different groups of people and we're comparing data? That would be a between subjects design. Or am I collecting data with the same group of people and I'm going to compare them back to themselves? That's a within subjects design. So I could have 10 athletes and I test them all at the beginning, and then I run whatever my intervention is, and I test them all again at the end, and I compare their score to what they got at the beginning. Or I can have a group of athletes A, a group of athletes B, a group of athletes C, and I'm going to do something with Group A, I'm going to do something different with Group B, and maybe Group C is going to be my control, and at the end of the day, I'm going to compare the groups against each other rather than the person against themselves. Okay? So, that comes under that design, research design kind of box on your template. Can you start to identify as you're reading, when I look at what they did, how did they set it up, what kind of data did they collect, what analysis did they do? Am I looking at within subjects or between subjects? Okay, you should be able to start trying to identify that idea. Okay? You may or may not have to write that at any point, but you should be able to identify it because it means you understand more about the plan of the data. And oftentimes when you're reading, they will actually tell you it's a within or between subjects design because that's an important point. Someone reading your study may look at what you've done and go, well, that doesn't make sense. Why did they set it up as a between? Why weren't they looking within? Right. Is that okay?
So then it'd be like a kind of pre-post test?
Yeah. And you could do a pre-post test with a between, but when you analyze the post, you wouldn't be analyzing it back to necessarily the pre, you might be analyzing the change score between the groups, right? So I ran 10 seconds, I ran 9.8 seconds, my change score is 0.2 of a second. What was the change score for the other training program? Right? So on page 97, they talk a little bit about, they talk you through some of that, and they look at the relationship between the question that you're asking and the method that you choose. How are you going to set up that data collection? What's the design? What's the plan for the data? Right? And then the next thing we want to pay attention to is looking at sampling. Because who your sample is, who your participants are, plays a big role in how well your results might be accepted by the bigger research body. Right? Just so you know, for future reference, the Thomas book that I pointed out to you that you'll use probably for 505, I know she's using it this semester, so I suspect you'll use it next semester, has some very good information on sampling as well. Right? It's got some helpful info in there. So, ideally what we want is random sampling. Right? If I'm going to test something, the goal is to have as little bias as possible, so the more random the population I use, the better chance I've got of being able to say that the outcome was due to the thing I introduced. Okay? So, if I can get a large enough sample, which can be difficult in our line of work, because people will often say, oh yes, we'll do that, but then they never send things back, or they don't follow through, or they don't turn up to the testing session. Right? Dylan has already had some introduction to what people do when they say they're interested in something. Just because they say they're interested does not mean they follow through. Okay? So what we want if we could, would be to say, because I found this with this group, I can be reasonably certain the thing I did was the cause of it, right? But there's some problems there. What if your sample's not large enough? It is possible to get someone who is good with stats, not me, possibly Dr. Culpepper, definitely the stats people over the road, right? Someone who's good at stats can run an analysis that will tell you how many people you need in your study. So you need 35 people for your sample to be large enough. You need 160 people for your sample to be large enough. Right? If I've got a random sample, that's my ideal situation. It's going to be a true experiment. If we have what we call a, some people call it purposive sample, then I'm going to look at trying to divide. I'm going to have this big sample, and I might say, okay, I'm going to have all the women in one group and all the men in the other group. Or we might have what we call a convenient sample. It's not quite as useful, because a convenient sample means I wasn't able to do a completely random situation, but I took all these people I could easily get at, so everyone in 8th grade PE in Albuquerque. Because I can drive around Albuquerque, I can get the PE teacher's approval, I can get all the parents' approval, but it's not exactly a random sample because our 8th grade PE students in Albuquerque different than 8th grade PE students in North Dakota. Okay. So it's random in that I don't know who these people are and I just went and got them, but it's convenient because I've got access, easy access to them. So if we use one of the sports teams on campus, that's convenient. Right? Systematic sampling means that you just toss a coin and pick someone out of a crowd. So, often in the movement literature, we end up using a volunteer or convenient sample. Mostly that's acceptable. It would be a limitation, right? Justifiably, it would be better if you ran the research with a completely random sample. So you have to make the statement that you understand that the convenience sample isn't the best option. But generally, the results from that kind of data, if the study is run well, are acceptable for publication. So it doesn't necessarily impede your chances of getting it into a journal. One of the ways you can get around a convenient sample is, once I've got the sample, what do I do with them, right? So at any point, random assignment is important, but it really helps out if you've got a convenient sample, because you can say, well, yes, I just took everybody that I could get my hands on in this classroom, but at least I put them randomly into my groups. So random assignment isn't the selection of the sample. It's once I've got all these people, or children, or whoever it is I'm going to use, what do I do with them, given that I've probably got more than one group set up? Okay. It was one of the pieces of feedback I got on my study was not only did I have a convenient sample, but I couldn't assign them because we were all doing the same thing and we didn't have enough children. Right? So that was not a very good idea, but we just worked with what we could get. And I got it published because as long as you can talk about it and you can explain why you did what you did, then hopefully people will go, oh, okay, right, under those circumstances. So let's go back to our design of training system 1A, training system B, control group. So maybe I put up a notice in the card and ask for volunteers for the study, and I get 150 students volunteer. How do I split my 150 students between my 3 groups that I've got? Right? That's the key when we're looking at random assignment. It's not okay to just say, okay, female white go here, female black go here, male black go here, right? Because that's too organized. You want to make it as random as possible so that the results are as valid as possible. So, you can get fancy computer programs that will randomize a sample for you. Right? You chuck in 150, you say you've got 3 groups, it'll tell you, you assign a number to each person, it'll tell you what number to put in what group, and it'll do it randomly. You can flip a coin, that's random. Right? So, do I put person number 1 in group A or B? You can pick it out of a hat. It doesn't matter as long as it isn't organized. Okay? Another way that you often see that helps with trying to make sure that you've got fairness and validity in your data is you'll see the term matched pairs. Matched pairs is a great way in our world to allow for the fact that not everybody is good at everything, and we see quite big differences in ability. Okay? So I've got 2 groups instead of 3 groups. I have a control group and an experiment group, and I've got my 150 odd people. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-test my 150 odd people. So let's say we're looking at a chin-up idea. We're looking at something to do with upper body strength. And we're going to use chin-ups as our testing measure. I'm going to measure everybody who volunteered. And then I've got to find the best 2, say, right? So I have 2 people who both did 24 chin-ups. Okay? So I'm going to take those 2 people and I'm going to flip a coin. And I'm going to put one of them in one group and one of them in the other group. And then perhaps I had 4 people who did 20 chin-ups. So I'm going to flip my coin twice and I'm going to split those people up between group A and group B. And I just work through until I've got everybody split. So I'm going to have some kind of characteristic, and I'm going to divide them up randomly between my groups based on that characteristic. Try not to get overwhelmed with all the information. The more you read research, the more familiar you'll start to become with some of these ideas, all right? Because they're all technical terms, and until you read research papers, you wouldn't have any reason to have come across them. So, you know, again, this is not, there's no exam. We're not expecting, maybe there should be an exam, maybe that's the way I should do it, right? But to me, I don't expect you to be able to define random assignment. Perhaps that's my error, right? Maybe that would make life easier for you later on. But to me, the goal is you should recognize the term random assignment the next time you read it in a paper. And if you can't remember what random assignment means, you should make the effort to go and look it up. Right? Because otherwise, if we have an exam and I say define random assignment, you're going to memorize what that means. You'll pass the exam, and the next time you see it in a paper, you won't remember it anyway. So what was the point? Right? Hello.
Hello, thank you.
Does that make sense? Right? So to me, it's not, this is not the time where you have to know what these mean, because that's a learning curve. You should recognize that you've come across it before, and you should start looking this stuff up. Because otherwise, you're going to be reading papers and not understanding what you're reading. And that makes life difficult for you. Okay, so, all right, we talked about variables earlier in the semester, so let's just do a quick review. Uh-oh, okay. Let's try it. I need the distance students who are watching this film to give me feedback about what works the best, because I'm running out of ideas. All right, so the dependent variable is the thing that you're interested in finding out about. Okay. So you're going to measure it because you want to see whether or not what you do changes it. So it could be speed, could be strength, could be personality, could be perception of your coach's style, right? Do they use a very dictator type style? Do they use a very autonomous type style, right? DV can be anything that you decide for it to be. And your independent variable is the thing you're messing around with. You want to see whether it changes the dependent variable. And there may be more than one level. So, did I forget my black pen? Of course I forgot my black pen. This one will be strong enough. So, if I do it here, they'll be able to see it. So, for example, you've got to be a little bit careful when you're looking at your independent variable, because let's say our dependent variable is strength, right? And I have program A and program B. And I want to see which program impacts this element of strength that I'm looking at. This is not two independent variables. This is one independent variable with two levels. So, my independent variable here would be the training program. Okay? And then I have level 1 and level 2. An example of another independent variable would be sex. Right? So, I want to measure changes in strength, but I want to look at program A and program B and the impact on males and females. Now I have two independent variables. Okay? So just be a little bit wary of that, because what I find is that when people write their purpose statements, they sometimes get themselves a little bit confused as to how many independent variables they've got. For you guys, at this level, in your purpose statement, we're looking for one dependent variable and one, at the most, two independent variables. I'm not going to approve 3, 4, and 5 or 2 DVs, because you don't want to start trying to work out the analysis for two dependent variables. Right? So you might not like it when I send back something and say you can't have this, pick one, but trust me, it's for your own good. Right? Because you want to keep it as simple as possible at the master's level. There's no reason to make it really complicated. Do you need me to run over this again? Does that make sense? Make sense? All right. Okay. All right. So, design issues. We've talked a little bit about, but the kinds of design that you're going to be recognizing when you read a quantitative paper. You'll be looking for words like, we had independent groups. We had repeated measures design, or a pre-post design. Just is literally what it says, a repeated measures. I test them once, and I do something, and then I test them again. Right? I repeat the measure on the group. So repeated measures is the same as a pre-post design. They may have something they call a crossover design. You might see pilot studies. So we talked a little bit about that the other week when we were looking at if I'm creating my own questionnaire, I would have to run a pilot study. All right? With the infrared timer, the first time we used that in the department, we ran a pilot study because we didn't quite know what to expect with it. And pilot studies add a bit of time to how long it'll take you to get it finished. But a pilot study will save you time later on if there was something wrong with the way you set the experiment up. Right? Because you want to catch that early. You don't want to collect 150, 250 people's worth of data and then start analyzing it and realize that you missed one thing you should have done before you collected the data. So you can do a pilot study on 15 people, 20 people, analyze your data, make sure everything's clean and that the whole experiment ran the way you expected it to, and then go out and collect your other 180 people and add them all together. Right? Adds a little bit of time, but saves a lot of grief later on, quite often. So, as you're reading, you know, you've already started this, you've been trying to pick out some design ideas, but as we move forwards into the next part of the semester, and you're reading papers that are deliberately going to support your purpose, you want to start paying attention to these kinds of ideas, because when you get into 505 and you have to write a methodology, what design are you going to set up for your methodology? So you want to start being able to recognize it as you're reading so that you can start to think about how you'll set your study up. Because after 505, if you go ahead and run the thesis and go on to collect this data, you don't want to have to spend a whole heap of time redesigning the data collection because you didn't do it very well in 505. So, short and sweet. Because the idea is not that you're supposed to walk out of 502 knowing everything. Okay? It's an introductory class to reading and understanding research. The only way ultimately that is going to happen is if you read it. Right? And I can say it till I'm blue in the face, but if you don't read a research paper at least every fortnight, you should be trying to read one at least every week, right? Then you're going to have a hard time, because this stuff gets way easier the more you read it. The language becomes a little more tangible. You've got to write very formally in grad school, like you have an umbrella poked up your backside. Right? The language is very peculiar. That's just the way it is. Okay? That's just the way it is. It's peculiar to me, and I'm English, and our language is a little more formal than yours anyway. And it's still hard to write in that style for research. Right? It's very much an antiquated, old-fashioned. APA and some journals are starting to modernize it a little bit. Some journals will allow you to write in the first person, for example. Typically, historically, you've only been allowed to write in the third person. You'll have to have that conversation with Dr. Berkey, because I don't know where she's going on that idea. There are certain terms that make you sound like you know what you're talking about, even if you don't. But if you use them in the right place, they make you sound very, very good. Right? The more you read, the more you'll pick up on that kind of terminology. Shouldn't say kids, it's always children. Is it young